To many people, today's dominant image of Elizabeth Barrett Browning remains that taken from the old barn burner of a melodrama, The Barretts of Wimpole Street. The fragile femme of Victoria's day on the chaise longue, addicted to opium, a suitable and very popular Broadway piece from 1931 for the then great, what did I say here? Catherine Cornell. Anybody remember her? Of course, Hollywood dressed it up in 1934 with their romantic stars of the day, Norma Shearer and Frederick March, and gave it the tagline, "When poets love, heaven and earth stand back to watch." It is true that Elizabeth Barrett did spend a lot of time on that chaise longue, and she was addicted to opium because laudanum was the doctor's prescription of choice for almost everything in those days. It is also true that she lived a virtual prisoner of her father. In modern terms, a Bible-banging bastard who refused all of his 12 children permission to marry, to write or receive letters or visitors without his permission. It is also true that, inexplicably, she loved her father. Upon his death, long after she had married and run to Italy, she wrote, "What shall we add now? He is dead. And I who praise and you who blame with wash of words across his name find suddenly declared instead on Sunday, 3rd of August, dead." As for her reputed fragility, horse feathers. She was a fireball. She had been for almost 2 decades a popular, widely read and admired poet. It was her work that drew Robert Browning to her. He admired her writing without reservation and begged her to guide him. He visited when father was away and quoted her poetry back to her. "One dove is answering in trust the water every minute, thinking so soft a murmur must have her mate's cooing in it. So softly does earth's beauty round infuse itself in ocean's sound." He called it, "This great living poetry of yours, the affluent language. You do what I always wanted. You speak out you." Up to the time of their meeting, Robert Browning had been writing, for the most part, plays, which are now at best locked away in a museum somewhere and no longer inflicted upon the poor public. What poetry he did publish was attacked cruelly, as hers would one day be, by the cognoscenti as being abstruse, impenetrable, inaccessible. They had an 18-month courtship by letter and secret meetings, and eloped to Marylebone Church on September 12th, 1846. Elizabeth, the Victorian weakling, agreed to marriage on condition. "You will promise to treat me en bon camarade, without the conventionalities of ladies and gentlemen, without constraint or ceremony. Don't be civil to me when you feel rude, nor loquacious when you incline to silence. Then I am ready to be articled as your correspondent." And that's when she composed, "Unless you can think when the song is done, no other is soft in the rhythm. Unless you can feel when left by one that all men else go with him. Unless you can know when unpraised by his breath that your beauty itself wants proving. unless you can swear for life, for death. Fear to call it loving. Elizabeth said of herself, only nuns of the strictest sect have led less restricted lives than I have. But how willingly I would exchange this helpless knowledge of books for some experience of life. And with Robert, life she lived. It was she who led him to the dramatic monologue and to what we call today stream of consciousness. At the same time, she was fully involved in the campaign to unite Italy. She is a heroine to the Italians. The Browning home, Casa Guidi, is an historic museum. Not only that, at the age of 43, after 3 miscarriages, this so-called weak, sick woman gave birth to a son, Robert Wiedemann Browning, whom they nicknamed Pen. And she continued to write. And that's what troubled the powers that be. For she sideswiped almost every social and moral injustice that came within her ken. On child abuse and the injustice of marriage itself. A woman screamed back, I'm a tender soul. I never banged a child at 2 years old and drew blood from him, but I sobbed for it next moment. And I've had a plague of 7. I'm tender. And this irony on the attitudes toward women. I perceive the headache is too noble for my sex. You think the heartache would sound decenter, since that's the woman's special, proper ache and altogether tolerable, except to a woman. On violence and peace. Peace. Peace is still your word? We say you lie then. That is plain. There is no peace, and shall be none, but such a peace as the ear can achieve twixt the rifle's click and the rush of the ball, twixt the tiger's spring and the crunch of the tooth, twixt the dying atheist's negative and God's face waiting after all. Then, 4 years before her death, came the work for which she was and would be excoriated. Aurora Leigh, a novel poem in 9 volumes, in which she tore a strip off England's elite with some of the most revolutionary sentiments concerning social matters. Mothers refused to allow their daughters to read it. Some reviewers called it grossly indecent. It was a bestseller, running to 4 editions. In book 6, she wrote a profoundly moving drama on social prejudices against women, which still, God bless us everyone, persist. But you think me really wicked? Seduced's your word. Do wolves seduce a wandering fawn in France? Do eagles who pinched a lamb with claws seduce it into carrion? So with me. I was not ever, as you say, seduced, but simply murdered. And what can you do with people when they are dead? But if you're pious, sing a hymn and go. Or if you are tender, heave a sigh and go. Elizabeth died June 29th, 1861. And the then famous critic, Edward Fitzgerald, had only this to write. Mrs. Browning's death is rather a relief to me, I must say. No more Aurora Leighs, thank God. A woman of a real genius, I know, but what is the upshot of it all? She and her sex had better mind the kitchen and their children, and perhaps the poor. Except in such little things as novels, they only devote themselves to what men do much better, leaving that which men do worse, or not at all. One can only deduce that he would have said the same of Jane Austen. But despite the opprobrium heaped on her, even today, her voice of undeniable beauty still calls out. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach, when feeling out of sight for ends of being and ideal grace. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need. By sun and candlelight I love thee freely, as men strive for right. I love thee purely, as they turn from praise. I love thee with a love I seemed to lose with my lost saints. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life. And if God choose, I shall love thee better after death. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, 1806-1861. Requiescat in pace.